Ed, it's great to see you again.
Good to see you, Scott.
So today we're going to talk about the H word, heresy. Not H-E double hockey sticks. It's heresy we're talking about. And this is an interesting concept because it it it's it's something that probably used to have a more volatile tinge on the ears in previous decades. There's this great book by Peter Berger, the sociologist, called The Heretical Imperative. And he says, in the ancient world, it took real guts to be a heretic, right? To really kind of chart out your own idea and to really go against consensus. But now it's almost the heretical imperative. Well, if you're not a heretic on some level, you're not a free thinker, right? So it's a very interesting kind of concept. But you, as an ancient historian, who studies Rome, I mean, this concept of heresy really impacted ancient Rome, especially in this Christian era when Rome became increasingly Christian. Fighting over heresy was often determinative of these heretical battles that seemed abstract. I mean, when you look back on them historically from modern eyes, they seem really abstract. And well, who cares about Christ's natures, or if he has one will or two wills, or these kind of things? But actually, these things had on the ground implications for real people and their lives, right?
Yeah, this is a very, very serious aspect of Roman history that starts in really with Christianity. I mean, there are aspects of this that you can trace all the way back through ancient Judaism, but it's really with Christianity and really the legalization and endorsement of the Christian church by the Emperor Constantine that gives extreme fuel to the question of what heresy is and what it means. But heresy had always been a problem in the ancient church. But heresy, in a sense, like in the third century, heresy had been something that would arise as the church changed, as it evolved, as it grew. And there would be questions about what is the appropriate way for a church to function under these new conditions. I mean, the best example of this is Paul, where you see Paul traveling around the Mediterranean, introducing communities to Christianity, and and then he leaves and he goes somewhere else, and other Christians come in, and they teach things. And these are not necessarily the things that Paul taught. So the letter to Galatians is a perfect example of this, where Paul gives a particular vision of what Christianity is, what Jesus' teaching means, and how a community like the Galatians, who are Greek speakers, who are not Jewish, how they can join this community and accept this teaching. And then someone else comes and says to them, in essence, well, you must adopt um, practices and behaviors consistent with Jewish law, because that's what a Christian is. Jesus was a Jew. Therefore, as a Christian, you must also be a Jew. And Paul has to go back and write to the Galatians and say, no, no. I mean, I was charged by God to give you a particular view of Christianity that does not say this. It's instead a superior way of approaching God. And so, from the very beginning of the development of the Christian community, heresy is a part of this. But the goal in early Christian communities is to address heresy by coming together, by finding a way that you can compromise. You can find some point of agreement so that the community can come back together and heal the wound. And we see this even in the third century, when the community is much, much larger than it is in the time of Paul. The church councils that are called by, say, Christian communities that bring in the theologian origin are designed to find consensus. They're designed to say, we had a disagreement. Now, how can we come back together? How can we make this community whole again? And so early Christianity is always struggling with heresy, but the imperative in early Christianity is to try to try to recognize that heresy occurred and use this as an opportunity to have a constructive conversation that can bring the community together and make it stronger again.
I remember. Well, first off, I mean, Christianity in the first 3 centuries, I've heard some scholars say that it's growing at like 30% a decade at some points, which is just astronomical. I mean, it's unbelievable. And I remember in seminary, a professor of mine who taught, he's now a seminary president, but he taught missiology, which is kind of the department of how the Christian mission goes on. How does it propagate? How does it, build Christian culture? How does it alleviate the needs of the poor? And I remember him giving this one lecture where he was giving signs of Christian vitality. And one of the points was heresy. He said basically heresies are a sign of vitality because there are signs that the faith is going to new places. It's getting more cultural. It's people are translating it. They're bringing in different thought forms. And so he's like, heresy is actually a good thing. And he was arguing that when heresy stops, it's probably because the church isn't growing anymore. And it's not telling the story in new languages and new cultures and new thought forms. That he was, and he was kind of a conservative professor. So everybody was kind of like, wow, this guy's advocating heresy. But he was saying like heresy is actually kind of a good thing for the life of a community because it shows that the community is still alive and debates are going on and the tradition is evolving.
Yeah, I think evolving is the key word there because you're right about the growth of Christianity. There's a book it's a controversial book, but a book by a sociologist named Stark who
Rodney Stark. Rodney Stark is the 30% growth thing I got. That's where I got that book. Got that.
And I think that he's probably right. I mean, I think if you look at where the church is at the time of Constantine's conversion in 312, the church had to have maintained that level of growth for 3 centuries to get to the point where it is. And I think you're exactly right that when you're growing in that fashion, especially in the Roman Empire, and I think this is the key context. The Roman Empire is, if it were a country now, it would be like the 4th biggest country in the world. It includes all or part of over 45 modern countries. It is massive and it is incredibly diverse. But it's also something that this is not the British Empire of the 19th century. This is basically, at the time of Constantine's conversion, a nation state. Everybody is a Roman citizen. Everybody has equal standing under the law. Everybody from all sorts of regions has a level of participation in this state. It is not a state that has segregated the Italians in Rome from the rest of the world. The rest of the territory under Roman control. It started that way. And when Jesus is born, all of the things you hear about the interactions of Roman officials and people in Judea, those are very real in the 1st century. But by the 4th century, that dynamic does not exist. And so when Christianity is growing, it's growing in a Mediterranean environment that's becoming more and more deeply integrated, where everyone in this space is coming more and more to identify common backgrounds, common legal statuses, common names, common approaches to thinking about history. And so Christianity is growing in an environment that is becoming more and more integrated. And what this means is exactly what you said. It's going to evolve and reflect the regional attributes and the thought structures and the ideas that this incredibly large and diverse space brings into the tradition. And so that will produce disagreements, right? How does somebody who is in, say, what's now Belgium, communicate with someone in Egypt? They have different languages, they have different religious orientations, they have different backgrounds, they live in a different climate, they think about different things, they approach the world in different fashions. And the church has to struggle with how you build something that works across this massive space. A space that stretches from the Crimea to the Sudan, and that stretches from Saudi Arabia to Scotland. And so that process of having diverse ideas come into the church and then hashing out how you can come up with something that brings these ideas together in a fashion that binds the community instead of separates it is one of the great achievements of the early church, and especially of the late 3rd century church. In the period, between the end of the persecution in 260 and the beginning of the Great Persecution in 305. This is a moment where the church, 303, this is a moment where the church really does figure out the way that you have productive conversations about different ideas. So it can facilitate that evolution. and bring a Christian community increasingly together. And it doesn't always work, of course. Um, when scholars talk about early Christianity, they talk about early Christianities because sometimes it doesn't work. There is no way to find a compatible set of ideas that bring together, say, Montanists in Asia Minor and and people who believe that basically Christianity is this deeply deeply mysterious, platonically influenced brand of superior knowledge and wisdom. There's no way to bring those people together. But the church is always trying to build the biggest coalition, the biggest tent, the biggest group of believers that it can by having these conversations to facilitate communication and building of community. And it's a great achievement that it's able to do this.
Who are your top three heretics? I mean, if you're going to list, if you're making your top three, like if you're the heretics roster, I mean, we could do 3 or 5. I mean, 5 would be a basketball team, right? Like,
yeah. 3 would be the Holy Trinity, right?
3 would be the Holy Trinity. Let's start with 3, and then if you get to 4 or 5, like, but who are your, and rank them in order. Rank them in order.
So
Go 3, 2, 1.
I'll rank them in terms of who I think is most interesting, because I think that you have some people who are heretical and deliberately looking to cause problems. And then I think you have other people who really kind of stumble into a situation and don't really understand what they've done. So I think that my favorite is a man named Arius, who is
I was going to say
teacher.
Arius. Arius was going to be my top. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think what Arius represents is the point of inflection where the church moves out of this third century pattern of trying to find consensus and moves into a fourth century pattern of saying, okay, well, now you either accept this or you're excluded. And Arius is the person who makes that happen. And so Arius is a Christian, he's a Christian theologian who lives in Alexandria. And Alexandria is the Oxford or the Cambridge, Massachusetts, or the Sorbonne of the ancient world. It is the place in the late third, early fourth century where you go to engage with cutting edge ideas. And it is the intellectual center. It's a major city. 500,000 people live in this city, but it's a major center of intellectual achievement. I mean, the great library is there. The museum is there. And so what Arius is doing is he's thinking about Christian theology in a way that engages with the intellectual interests of the community around him. And those interests are overwhelmingly Platonic and theological. And Platonic theology says, in essence, there is a supreme God, one supreme God. And then there are divinities that emanate down from this God. But to not acknowledge the supremacy of that God is to diminish that God and to miss the whole purpose of a divine system. And what Arius says, in essence, is, well, this is how we can understand Christianity, right? There is a supreme God. And then there are other divine attributes that are different from God in their fundamental nature, but they're still divine. And Jesus is one of them. And Arius says, in essence...
And Jesus is like the 2 guy, right? I mean, Jesus is as close as you can get to
what Arius
the supreme.
says is the only difference in their nature or in their essence is the fact that Jesus was created. There was God, and God is eternal. And then there was a moment when Jesus was not. And then there was a moment when Jesus was. And that differentiates Jesus from God. Jesus has just a different essence, an ousia in Greek. And that is a way to make Christianity work with this Platonic idea of the supremacy of God. But this is something, Arius basically runs Bible studies for intellectually inclined people in a particular region of the city of Alexandria, a region that is pretty close to one of the intellectual centers in the city. And so we have to imagine that he's not a bishop. He's a presbyter. He runs a church in one region of Alexandria, and he teaches this in basically Bible study to a particular group of people, like one day a week.
Yeah. So he's running a church for intellectuals. He's like a parish minister who's, this guy's church is where you go if you're a reflective thinker, right? Like, and He's a parish priest, basically.
Yeah, that's basically it. I mean, he's doing what his congregation and his group of acolytes, and not even all of them, right? This is probably a small group within his congregation that's coming and doing these kinds of discussions. And who knows? I mean, if we were to actually think about this, we might imagine that Arius is sitting in the room and they're having a conversation. Arius says, "Hey, wait, this is actually a really good idea. Like, let's follow this idea where it goes. Where it goes is this notion that God is superior to Jesus, not because Jesus is not divine, but because there's a moment when Jesus did not exist. And so what Arius then does is he teaches this stuff in his Bible study. Eventually it comes to the attention of the bishop that Arius is saying this. And the bishop says, I think that this is wrong. This diminishes Jesus, and we can't have that. And he tells Arius to stop. And what Arius says is basically, I'm not going to stop, right? I was inspired by divine teachers and I was inspired by God. This is an argument that Paul uses in Galatians. I was inspired by God, and this interpretation is correct. And when the bishop tells him to stop, Arius gets other bishops from Libya to write in and say, no, what Arius says is right. And so we have a conflict. If this were the third century, what you would do is you would call in some superior Christian intellect. If Origen was still around, you'd call in the great teacher who could come, bring everybody together and try to facilitate some kind of compromise that theologically everybody could agree to. And there was space to do this. But the dynamic changes because the Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity. And then when the Emperor Constantine, who was a Western emperor, takes over control of both the East and the West in 324, the Emperor Constantine walks into this conflict in the biggest city in the Eastern Mediterranean. And Constantine's program as a Christian emperor was to try to make the church stronger by giving it money and by giving it privileges. And for Constantine, this means there has to be one church. You can't give money to all of these different churches, right? There's one Christian church. You're giving them money. You're giving them status. You're giving them prestige. And in Alexandria, whose church is that? Is it Arius's church? Or is it the bishop's church? And when you have bishops from Libya saying it should be Arius's church, and you have bishops from other places saying it should be the Alexandrian bishop's church, you have a conflict. And so Constantine recognizes that this conflict is becoming more serious. It's becoming a regional conflict, not just an Alexandrian conflict. And he summons everybody to come to the city of Nicaea, which is right now just 100 miles or so from Istanbul. And he summons everybody to Nicaea, and they have a big council. And everybody at this church council starts functioning like it's a third century council, where they're going to find some compromise. And they actually come up with a document that it seems will be a compromise document that they can all agree to. Constantine then walks in and he inserts a clause in this that makes the basic contention that Arius was making, renders it impossible to find a compromise. And Constantine says this creed is the creed. It says this, Arius's ideas are heretical, and now we're going to move forward, and this is what the church is. You accept this, you're the church. If you don't accept this, you're not the church. The reason I think Arius is so fascinating, because Arius never wanted that. Arius never wanted his ideas to be something that separates the church. What Arius wanted was for his ideas to promote and provoke a conversation. And when he realizes in the late 320s and early 330s that his ideas have created this fissure in the church, Arius goes to Constantine and he recants. And he says, I will sign on to whatever you want. I don't want to be separated from the church anymore. These ideas are important to me. I think they're right, but the church is more important. And he goes to Constantine, he signs a document, and we have a story told by a number of later ecclesiastical historians that Arius signs this document like on a Friday. And he goes out into the city of Constantinople and he's going to take Mass on Sunday. And he's going to be officially reunited into the church and restored to communion on Sunday. And he goes out into the city and he's immediately seized by an attack of horrible explosive diarrhea. And so he goes into a public toilet, and the story says he basically poops his life out and dies in the public toilet
Wow.
before he can be restored to communion, because Arius is a heretic and you can't bring him back into communion. And our sources that tell us this are written 100 years later, and they say you can still go and visit the toilet where Arius died. And so the story you have there is somebody who fundamentally did not want to be a heretic. He fundamentally wanted the church to be unified. And when he saw that what he was doing was endangering that unity, he walked it back. But heresy had gone so far that he was seen as irredeemable. And this story came up about how God would not let him be redeemed, even though he repented, even though he agreed, even though he returned himself theologically to the space of the Orthodox, he would not be allowed to do it. And so there's something very fundamentally different about the world Arius was born in and the world he died in. And something where the nature of Christianity has changed. You cannot, if you are Arius, repent and rejoin. You are just a heretic. You're too far gone, and you can't come back. And that was probably the most profoundly distressing thing to Arius. And so this is why I think he's, my favorite, because he represents two different worlds. And he's very much trying to live in a world that no longer exists. And the Christian space that he's trying to occupy no longer exists for him. And he did not want that.
And his antagonist, Athanasius, was a much more difficult personality, it seems. Now, like in the Christian tradition, Athanasius is kind of romanticized and Arius is kind of villainized, but it seems like Arius was the more charitable figure, where Athanasius seems like he was kind of the guy who became the creator or defender or maybe creator of this kind of Christian orthodoxy. He seemed like a more prickly person.
Oh, yeah. No, I think that what's interesting about Athanasius is there's a generation of bishops and presbyters and Christians, and Arius belongs to this generation, that came of age during a time of persecution. And so they understand why it's important for the church to come together. They understand why it's important for an institution that serves God in conditions that can be difficult, that can be really dangerous. It's important that this institution facilitates conversations that make the community stronger. And what Athanasius represents is a new generation that comes of age when the church is both legal and powerful. And so Athanasius understands that the church now doesn't exist outside of imperial power. It doesn't exist outside of the space where emperors get involved in its operations. And the church is no longer a kind of up by its bootstraps private organization. It's in a sense a public entity that gets government support. And that means that there's massive potential to use those resources to make yourself as a leader of the church stronger. And Athanasius is the best of his generation at capitalizing on this public profile and playing in the arenas of imperial power. He's really, really good at it. But when you do that, you are doing a different sort of project than someone like Arius was doing.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting because you're now kind of you're corporate sponsored.
Yeah.
In Athanasius' day, right? Like, but brought to you by Frito-Lay or whatever. Like, you're really conscious, I guess, is what you're saying, of your kind of state sponsorship, and you're running a different kind of rig. I mean, you just got to run a different kind of operation than if you're Arius, and it's a little more Wild West, right? And it's a little more, the church's kind of alternative community versus the chaplain to the empire.
Yeah. Exactly. And I think the Wild West is an interesting way to think about it. But I think that it's important to imagine someone like Arius never intending to cause the problems that he did. I mean, he's a prickly guy and he thinks he's right, but he didn't think through the implications of what pushing that to the limit would actually be, especially in conditions that he couldn't imagine. I mean, no one in the East imagined when that conflict started, that the Emperor Constantine would convert to Christianity and dump all this money on an entity called the Church. Um, but I think so. If we go to my second heretic, it's going to be very controversial. But I would say the Emperor Justinian is maybe my second choice. Not because he's officially outside of the church. He's not right now officially outside of the church. But what the Emperor Justinian does is he takes this Athanasian imperative, and he takes it to a kind of its natural limit, where he says, in essence, that the role of the emperor is to guard orthodoxy. And he changes the nature of what religion is, and especially what Christianity is in the Roman Empire, where he creates a space that had never existed before. And what Justinian says is not only is the church going to be what we support with our resources, but it's also the emperor's job to intervene to be sure that everybody is not only Christian, but legitimately wants to be Christian and they are honestly a Christian. So if you get baptized, but you don't mean to do it, or you're not taking it seriously, it is the same as not being baptized at all. And to make this really strong idea of the emperor decides what Christianity is and ties membership in the Christian community to legal status as a full citizen of the Roman state, the Emperor Justinian starts intervening in theological matters. And he tries
And
to find,
is he reading theology? I mean, is he
yeah,
theologically educated? Okay, so
yeah,
he's
yeah.
he's into it. I mean, it's not just political. He's got a real interest.
Oh yeah, no, he's a brilliant thinker, but he's an incredibly dangerous man as well. He's one of these people who's probably, I don't know, it's hard to say, but he's one of the smartest people alive at that time. And he has the full power of the Roman state. And he has a very big ego. And he has incredible capacity. And so what you have with Justinian is this incredibly toxic mixture of a figure who is egomaniacal, brilliant, and well-read. And so he intervenes in theology. He actually writes theological treatises. But the decision that Justinian makes that I think is heretical or should be heretical is Justinian holds a church council to try to bring the Catholic Church in the East together with what will become the Orthodox churches in the Catholic Church in the West, to bring them together with what will become the Orthodox churches in the East. And he tries to find some sort of theological formula that they can agree to. And what he decides to do is condemn dead people who died in communion with the church. And so what he ends up doing at this council in Constantinople is he singles out certain thinkers and certain works written by people who had been dead for centuries and throws those works out. And ultimately, most prominently, he throws out the works of the theologian Origen, who had died 300 years before.
That's a top church mistake, throwing out Origen. I mean, Origen was a superstar.
Oh, yeah. But there's also a huge problem with that, right? I mean, if you think through the implications of this, you have somebody who was martyred 300 years before, and 300 years later, you're going to throw him out of heaven, right? You're going to throw him out of the community. You're going to disestablish him as a church leader, and you're going to disestablish him as a Christian. And so this is a move that people from the East are really troubled by. They're saying in essence, like these are people who did not have the chance to repent, right? If they did wrong, they didn't know that they had done wrong. They were never informed that what they had done was a sin, that what they were saying was heretical. They had no chance to repent of it. So how can you throw these people out of the community posthumously? And Justinian brings up a very shallow rationale that he gets from St. Augustine, he says. He says, well, they did this in North Africa once 100 years ago, so we can do it. But really what you have there is somebody who has taken the idea of a church belonging to the state to its sort of logical extreme, right? If the emperor is the state, the emperor is entrusted by God to govern the state, then the emperor has the power to directly intervene in church affairs because these actions and these activities all come together. But what Justinian does by asserting that prerogative is incredibly destructive to what the nature of a Christian community is. Um, because Christianity is about the possibility of sinners being restored, of sinners repenting, of sinners being brought into share in a community of God and do it eternally. And if you died 300 years ago, you do not have the opportunity to repent for your sins. And you're just, what, getting thrown out of heaven? Or getting thrown out of the community of the righteous? It can't work in the way that Christians conceive of the world. And so it's a very, very dangerous thing to what Christianity means. And it's actually, if you read the earliest Christian writings, it goes against everything that Jesus is promising and that Paul is promising. Um, this is not what the New Testament says. You should not be able to do this. And so this is why, even though Justinian has not been condemned as a heretic, he very clearly is a problematic figure. And I will say he was condemned by a heretic by the Coptic Church and the Syrian Orthodox Church and a number of the Armenian Church. There are many churches that did condemn him. The Greek Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church, they did not condemn him. So I guess we can use him as a
It's
heretic,
the
I suppose.
it's the big franchises that like Justinian, right? Because they probably like a little Justinianism, right? If you're kind of a smaller franchise, Justinian's more of a threat. All right, now who's
Well,
number
and
three on our list?
so number three, so I think number three would be the emperor. Well, let's go with Leo the Third, the Byzantine emperor. And so Leo the Third is condemned as a heretic, but he's a complicated figure. So Leo the Third takes power in 717 AD. While there is an Arab siege of the city of Constantinople, that if it succeeds is going to certainly eliminate the existence of the Roman Empire. I mean, it will collapse because Constantinople is the capital, it is the center of defense, and the Arabs remain there for an entire year. They besiege it, from summer to summer, and Leo waits this out. But what Leo grew up on the frontier, and so Leo grew up on the frontier at a time when Arab leaders had very strongly embraced the Muslim idea of aniconic representation, no images of human figures. And so, there's a very famous moment where Abdul Malik, one of the early caliphs, takes images of people off of the coins and replaces them with Quranic verses. And Abdul Malik is the strongest push or the strongest sort of sponsor of this. And Leo is a younger contemporary of Abdul Malik. So Leo wins, defends Constantinople, and as the 710s give way to the 720s, we begin to see that Arab attacks on cities in the Eastern Mediterranean are met by people who, for example, refuse to use icons. One of the great ways that the city of Constantinople defended itself was the patriarch would lead processions with icons of Christ and the Virgin Mary. The Virgin Mary is seen as the protector of the city of Constantinople around the city walls while the Arab siege was taking place. This is a practice that had started under the Emperor Heraclius in the 620s, and it had become part of the Roman defensive strategy, right? The soldiers fought with weapons, and if you couldn't fight with weapons, you fought with your faith, and you joined these processions, and you'd invoke the Virgin to come and protect the city. But in 725, defenders of the city of Nicaea, instead of embracing the icon of the Virgin Mary, one of them throws dung at the icon while the city is under siege. And they successfully beat back the siege. And so what we begin to see is this idea of moving away from physical representations or pictorial representations of saints, of Jesus, of the Virgin Mary, is something that Leo begins to do. Now, Leo does not pressure anybody else to do this. He does not persecute people so that this can happen. But what Leo does is he pushes the empire in this direction to start thinking theologically about what icons mean and how they're used and whether we should pray to icons or not. This is the beginning of the iconoclastic movement. Now, this is a movement that under Leo's son Constantine takes some serious turns. I mean, the texts tell us that he's undertaking really violent persecutions of people who still pray to icons. That's really debatable. There are some people probably who he does kill. But this is a moment where what Leo is saying, and what Constantine later embraces more fully, is this idea that early Christians did not pray to icons. And so praying to icons is an innovation. It's an innovation that comes out of processes of change. And for them, for Leo and for Constantine, it represents a decline from true Christian practice. It represents a moving away from a society that functions as it's supposed to. And so iconoclasm for them is not a revolutionary change in how Christianity functions. It's a return to how Christianity functioned more purely. And the empire will be better because it moved back to what was working when the empire was stronger. And so there, the rhetoric of decline mixes in with theological ideas and theological approaches. But ultimately, the rhetoric that they're using requires the empire to do well. And so if iconoclasm is going to do what it's supposed to do, the empire is supposed to then recover the territory it lost and recover the strength that it lost. And that doesn't happen. And so what happens ultimately is in the 9th century, the Byzantine Empire, the Roman Empire of the East, moves away from iconoclasm because iconoclasm doesn't seem to work. And so Leo, who started this, gets pegged as a heretic. And so Leo gets this tag of, the heretic who started the iconoclastic movement somewhat unfairly. His son really did a lot more to make this an actual thing, an actual movement, an actual evolved theological idea. But Leo gets tagged with being the originator of this, in part because the process of engaging critically with these changes in religious behavior and in Christian behavior began under him. And so I think that's why he's a particularly fascinating character, because in his life, he also died in the peace of the church. He died in communion. He had not moved to that level where people were condemning him as aggressively as they will later condemn him.
So let me ask you today, like in American society, you and I are both coastal people. Like we're living on the coasts. Maybe we're coastal elites. People, they always throw those. I don't know if that's a dispersion or what, but is the concept of heresy meaningful today? I mean, are there contemporary heresies? Can you think of something analogous today to this kind of discussion where things are heretical and treated as such?
I think that we see heresy in a host of different places. Obviously, this is something that we still see in Christian communities. Where there are ideas that are incompatible with being a member of particular Christian communities and Christian denominations. And I think in particular, if you're looking at mainline Protestant communities, you've seen things like the Dutch Reform and the Presbyterian Church. You've seen people split off over things like the ordination of women or the inclusion of same-sex couples in the community, full participation in the community. And so you see these churches split off because of this. The Anglican Church, of course, a few years ago had a really significant split between denominations in Africa and denominations in parts of America and in the UK. And so this is still something we see in Christian communities. But I think what's interesting is we also see it in political communities, both in the left and the right. There are certain there's a certain diversity of ideas and approaches that existed in both political parties 50 years ago that doesn't exist anymore. And there definitely in recent years has been a push, specifically most prominently and publicly among the Republican Party, but also the Democratic Party too, to exclude people whose ideas do not fit whatever the party orthodoxy is. And so we're seeing this right now with the Republican Party and the kind of embrace of, Trumpism and Stop the Steal in particular, where you have people who are lifelong Republicans who, under any kind of conception of the Republican Party anyone would recognize 10 years ago, are Republicans, and in the inner circle of Republicans, people like Liz Cheney, who are now basically getting nearly drummed out of the party. It's a really significant shift. And I think we can go back to this idea of heresy as a product of change and a reaction to change. Change is something that makes people uncomfortable. And if you are uncomfortable, you begin to think about the implications of your feelings, what might be causing them, and you react in the fashion that we see in early Christianity too, where the reaction to change frequently is to limit the community in such a way that you can embrace what you think is the essential core of meaning in that community and exclude the people whose ideas and practices and approaches are making you uncomfortable.
I mean, I wonder, is there an evolutionary lesson here? Like, if you look at evolutionary biology, change makes you viable, right? With the exception of the crocodile or something, which is like, I think if I wouldn't be a human, because I guess since like prehistoric times, the crocodile hasn't evolved, which is fascinating because it's like, hey, I've got the winning design. I don't need to change. But normally, right, that most species thrive by evolving, by adaptation and change. And so I wonder, is there like an evolutionary analogy here where if you can't tolerate heresies and dialogue with them, are you kind of historically condemned to a cul-de-sac or something? Or is the inability to tolerate heresy something that is going to condemn any kind of religious or political community to the dustbin of history?
I think it's a really fascinating way to think about it. I think that what happens is the essentialist idea of what that community is that doesn't tolerate change, I think, is doomed to a cul-de-sac. But the community itself, I think, it can basically move in such a way that those people become the heretics. Think of the post-Vatican II Catholic community, where the way the Catholic community worked in, say, the 1950s, there are people who still want that to be the Catholic community. But after Vatican II, the Catholic Church moved, in a sense, the center of that community away from those people. And so those people whose ideas in the 1950s were the center of the church, they're getting increasingly marginalized. So Latin Mass is something that now, in the 50s, was what Mass was. Now Latin Mass is something that is very limited, and there's a very strong political implication if you are embracing Latin Mass in a particular fashion.
And the people that go to it, to go to Latin Masses, are overwhelmingly young people. Like, those
Yeah,
masses are populated by younger people, which
so
is
that's
so strange.
interesting. That's interesting. So I think that what you get with those communities is, the center of the community moves, and there might be vitality in what comes out of it, or it might fade away. But I think it's perfectly possible to imagine, say, like a Trumpist Republican Party in 20 years not being the Republican Party anymore, but being a kind of group on the side that maybe coalesces with, 100 people in like a Elks Lodge around Eric Trump coming to give some kind of talk. And the party has basically moved beyond this. And so the center sort of shifts. And this group that was once the center retains its connection to the ideas that once were central to the community, but the group itself becomes smaller, and it may disappear. It may just become a small sort of community that exists in its own space. Um, but I think you're right that the evolution of communities and ideas is essential for these communities to remain vital and vibrant. And if you aren't having that evolution, you are, in a sense, in a cul-de-sac because the conditions will continue to change and your group will continue to be stuck in a set of ideas that no longer reflect the broader concerns and ideas of the world around you.
When you teach this stuff, right, when you talk about heresies and ancient history, you teach undergrads, how do they respond? I mean, do they have a sense for this? Because again, most of your students are probably less religiously observant than a few decades ago and stuff like this. I'm interested. How do they respond when you teach things like this? Are they curious? Do they find it interesting? Who do they identify with in these kind of controversies?
Uh, I think that they do not. I mean, many of my students, because we're in San Diego, many of my students are not Christian. They were not raised as Christians. And so they don't really even have baseline understanding of what the Trinity is, for example. So they don't understand what Arius' theology was in relation to, say, a contemporary Protestant or Catholic theology. But what they do understand is him as a person and the kinds of choices that he was making. And I think what's important to get them thinking is to get them to imagine these as individuals who are troubled by the world around them and are troubled by the consequences of the choices they made. And I think we can identify with the struggles of individuals to fit into the world around them, and the struggles of individuals to find a community that they feel that they can belong to that reflects their own ideas and their own understanding of the world. So I try to present this in a way that humanizes these people. I don't think that there's anybody, despite the fact that, for example, Arius was seen as irredeemable by people in the fourth and fifth century. I don't think there's anybody who's irredeemable in these heretical discussions. I don't think anybody is trying to create these problems. What they're trying to do is understand uh, fundamental truth that's essential to what they believe to be the purpose of their life, and understand it in a way that uh, they believe is consistent with the way the world works and consistent with the way that the supernatural world works and the spiritual world works and the world of God works. And when you feel like you found something like that, I think it's essential for students to grasp, even if they don't accept the idea, that the person we're talking about understood that idea to be essential to the project of that person's life, and to the meaning of that person's life. And so I think that's how students can identify with these people. The ideas are not ideas that many undergraduates have reckoned with. Um, but the challenges of individuals trying to figure out how to live according to their convictions, and find a place in a community that supports them, that is something my students can identify with. And it's something I think we all can identify with, um, especially in post-pandemic world where our communities have been fragmented, our interactions with people have been disrupted. Um, we have spent a lot of time with our ideas and not as much time with people. And this reality, I think, can get us to a better understanding of why in antiquity these ideas animate people so much. Why they feel it's so important not only to defend your idea, but do it in a way that allows you to be a member of a community. And why people like Arius might say, I value the community more than the idea in the end.
Well, I hope that we, as we emerge from the pandemic, that we get some more interesting heresies, and that they create some more interesting communities, which are.
Yeah, this was wonderful, Scott. Thanks so much.